In the year 2003, the United States military was the most powerful force on planet Earth. It had won the Cold War without firing a single major shot at its greatest enemy. It had crushed Iraq in 1991 in just 100 hours, a campaign so dominant that military historians scrambled to rewrite their textbooks. Its economy was the undisputed engine of the entire world. Its technology was a generation ahead of any rival. Its alliances stretched from Europe to Asia to the Pacific. No nation dared challenge it directly. The American century appeared not just real, but permanent. And then America made a decision so catastrophic, so reckless, so strategically blind, that historians will debate it for the next 100 years. Not just military historians, political historians, economic historians, historians of empires and their inevitable recurring declines. It invaded Iraq, not because Iraq attacked America, not because Iraq had nuclear weapons pointed at New York or London, not because the United Nations sanctioned the action, not even because America's closest allies agreed it was necessary or wise, but because it could. Because the momentum of a traumatized nation after September 11th had created an atmosphere where caution was dismissed as weakness, where questions were treated as disloyalty, and where the seductive logic of overwhelming force had replaced careful, strategic thinking. America invaded Iraq because it believed its power alone could reshape the world, and that anyone who doubted this simply lacked the vision to see it. They were wrong, in ways that would echo across the entire 21st century and beyond. Why does this matter to you right now, today? Because the consequences of that single decision never stopped. They did not end when the last American combat troops left Iraq in 2011. They did not end when Saddam Hussein was executed in 2006. They did not end when Barack Obama declared the war over, or when George W. Bush declared mission accomplished from the deck of an aircraft carrier in May of 2003. The consequences are still unfolding, still shaping governments and borders and conflicts across the globe. The war cost America over $2 trillion in direct spending, money borrowed, mostly from China, that added to a national debt that still burdens every American taxpayer. It destabilized an entire region held together, however brutally, by strongmen and carefully managed alliances. It created the exact conditions: chaos, grievance, power vacuum, that gave birth to ISIS, arguably the most dangerous terrorist organization the modern world had ever seen. It handed Iran the most geopolitical influence it had ever held in its modern history, transforming a contained regional rival into a dominant power, stretching its reach from Tehran to Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a. It drained the American military of its best soldiers, its best equipment, and the best decades of a generation of officers and strategists who were worn down by repeated rotations through an unwinnable conflict. And perhaps most devastatingly, it told the rest of the world something terrifying. It told them that even the mightiest superpower on Earth could be trapped, tied down, humiliated, forced to spend trillions fighting insurgents with improvised weapons. The myth of American invincibility, that invisible shield that had protected the global order since 1945, had been cracked open for the entire world to examine. And every rival, every adversary, every nation that had ever resented American power took careful, detailed notes. To understand what really went wrong in Iraq, you have to understand that there were actually two entirely different wars happening simultaneously, governed by different rules, requiring different strategies, and measured by completely different standards of success. War number one was the military war, the conventional war that America had spent decades preparing for, equipping itself to fight, and training its soldiers to win. And on those terms, America crushed it. 3 weeks, 21 days from the opening airstrikes to the fall of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein's statue was pulled down in Firdos Square as the world watched live on television. The Iraqi army, once feared as battle-hardened after 8 years of war with Iran, essentially collapsed. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite forces, melted away into the civilian population rather than face American firepower in open battle. On paper, it was the fastest, most overwhelming conventional military victory in decades. But war number two was the strategic war. The political war of governance, legitimacy, reconstruction, and nation-building. The war that asked not how to defeat Saddam, but what happens the morning after he falls. Who would govern Iraq? How would the power vacuum be filled? What would be done about the explosive ethnic and religious fault lines, the Sunnis, the Shias, the Kurds, that Saddam had violently suppressed for decades, and that would not simply disappear because he was gone? America had no plan for this war. The State Department had spent more than a year preparing detailed post-war plans covering governance structures, economic recovery, and the management of Iraq's diverse communities. Those plans were largely ignored and dismissed. The Pentagon, riding the confidence of its military success, believed the transition would be self-managing, that democracy would emerge naturally from the ruins of tyranny, and that grateful Iraqis would do the heavy political lifting while American troops drew down and went home. It was one of the most catastrophic planning failures in American military history. Here is the paradox that nobody in Washington wanted to admit. America had the finest air force ever assembled in human history. It had satellite-guided missiles capable of threading a window from 30,000 feet. It had stealth bombers that radar could not detect. It had carrier strike groups projecting devastating firepower from hundreds of miles offshore. It had special operations forces so lethal they could eliminate a target in complete darkness from miles away without alerting a single neighbor. And none of it mattered against an insurgency. You cannot bomb your way out of a civil war. You cannot use stealth bombers against men who plant roadside bombs at 3 in the morning in neighborhoods they have lived in their entire lives. You cannot defeat an enemy with no headquarters to destroy, no supply lines to cut, no air force to ground, and no population clearly separate from your own forces. The entire doctrine of American military supremacy, built for a confrontation with the Soviet Union across the plains of Europe, was designed for a different kind of war than the one Iraq became. America won every single tactical engagement in Iraq. Every patrol that was ambushed fought back and prevailed. Every raid on an insurgent safe house was a military success. The kill ratios were staggering by any historical measure. American casualties, though deeply painful and utterly real to the families who bore them, were a fraction of what any planner would have predicted for an occupation force in a country this hostile. And America was still losing the war. Because the battlefield was not just a physical place, it was the mind and loyalty of the Iraqi population. Every raid on a civilian home that found nothing destroyed trust in entire neighborhoods. Every checkpoint that humiliated ordinary Iraqis going about their daily lives drove recruits into the insurgency. Every civilian casualty, and there were tens of thousands, created grieving families with every reason to pick up a weapon. The more force America applied, the more resistance it generated. A trap with no exit, because the very tools America used best were the tools most likely to make the underlying problem worse. Look at a map of Iraq. Iraq sits at the crossroads of one of the most contested regions on Earth. It borders Iran to the east, a country that despised American presence and had been labeled part of the axis of evil just 1 year before the invasion. It borders Syria to the northwest, which became a highway for foreign fighters and weapons flowing into Iraq's Sunni heartland. It borders Turkey, a NATO ally that refused to allow the American military to use its territory for a northern invasion. Every border was a vulnerability. There was no clean exit and no safe rear area. Here is the secret most people missed. The geopolitical calculation Iran had been quietly running for decades. Saddam Hussein had fought Iran in a brutal 8-year war from 1980 to 1988. That war killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. Saddam had used chemical weapons against Iranian forces. He was, in every meaningful strategic sense, Iran's greatest regional enemy, the man and the regime that contained Iranian power and prevented its expansion westward. And now the United States, with no coherent post-war plan, no understanding of the region's fault lines, no strategy for the aftermath, had removed him, for free, without Iran having to fire a single bullet. Iran did not need to defeat America militarily. It simply needed to ensure that America could never stabilize Iraq enough to leave. The way to do that was to fund, arm, train, and direct the Shia militias that American forces could pursue but never truly destroy. That is exactly what Iran did. Systematically, patiently, and with strategic intelligence that far outmatched Washington's planning in the critical years after the invasion. The consequences of the Iraq invasion did not stay in Iraq. They cascaded outward in waves, touching every corner of the global system. Here is how the dominoes fell, one by one. The first domino was oil. Iraq sits on the world's 5th largest proven oil reserves. Before the invasion, Iraqi oil production, though limited by sanctions, was a functioning part of global energy supply. After the invasion, production collapsed. Infrastructure was bombed, looted, and then sabotaged by insurgents who understood that disrupting oil exports was itself a strategic weapon. Global energy markets, already jittery from post-9/11 uncertainty, panicked. Oil prices began a dramatic rise that would reach record highs by 2008, reshaping economies across the world. The second domino was inflation. When energy costs rise, everything rises with them. Transportation costs rise, manufacturing costs rise, food prices rise, because food is grown, processed, packaged, and delivered using energy at every step. Ordinary people across the world, in Nigeria, India, Brazil, Eastern Europe, paid more for fuel, more at the grocery store, more for heating their homes. All because of a war in a country most of them had never visited and could not have found on a map. The third domino was credibility. America's justification for the war was weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the UN Security Council in February 2003 and presented what he described as definitive intelligence. It was completely wrong. There were no WMDs. France and Germany had begged Washington to wait for the weapons inspectors to complete their work. They were dismissed as cowards and obstructionists. When the WMDs never materialized, those allies lost faith in American judgment in ways that shaped their foreign policy for the following 2 decades. The transatlantic relationship, the bedrock of the post-war international order, had been badly damaged. The fourth domino was the international order itself. If the world's most powerful nation could invade a sovereign country based on false intelligence, what stopped other powerful nations from doing the same? The rules-based international order, built after World War II precisely to prevent the strong from devouring the weak, had been violated by its own most powerful creator and champion. The precedent was set. The world noticed and drew conclusions. The planners of the Iraq War were not stupid people. Many were among the most credentialed and experienced individuals in the American foreign policy establishment. They had PhDs from elite universities, decades of government experience, and access to the finest intelligence agencies on Earth. And they were spectacularly, catastrophically wrong about almost everything. Senior officials estimated the war would last 6 days. Others said 6 weeks. They believed Iraqis would greet American soldiers with flowers, a phrase that became grimly ironic as years of occupation ground on. They believed democracy would bloom naturally once Saddam was removed, as if it were a seed waiting only for sunlight. They believed Iraq's oil revenues would pay for reconstruction, meaning the war would ultimately cost American taxpayers nothing. Every single assumption was wrong, and had been predicted as wrong loudly and clearly by experts who understood the region and by allies who had dealt with the Middle East far longer than Washington's ideologues. The decision to de-Baathify Iraq, to immediately fire every member of Saddam's Baath party from government and military positions, was one of the most destructive single policy choices of the entire war. Hundreds of thousands of people were thrown out of their jobs overnight. Many had joined the Baath Party not out of ideological commitment, but simply because membership was required for any meaningful career in Saddam's Iraq. These were men with military training, with weapons, with organizational skills, and now with no stake in the new order America was trying to build. Many became the organizational core of the Sunni insurgency. Many eventually helped build and lead the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The war that was supposed to end in weeks was still raging 8 years later. The costs that made headlines were real. The death counts, the dramatic battles, the car bombings, the images of devastation in Fallujah and Mosul and Baghdad. But there were quieter, slower, and in many ways more devastating costs that were never fully captured by the news cycle. The hidden human cost. America deployed its finest combat units year after year in rotations that became a grinding, relentless cycle with no clear end. The same soldiers went back 3, 4, 5 times. The psychological toll was unlike anything the American military had experienced since Vietnam. Suicide rates among Iraq war veterans skyrocketed to levels that shocked military health professionals and overwhelmed the Veterans Administration system. Post-traumatic stress disorder became a national epidemic, affecting hundreds of thousands of veterans and rippling outward through their families. Marriages broke under the strain of year-long separations and the invisible wounds soldiers brought home. Children grew up with parents who were physically present but psychologically still somewhere in Ramadi or on a road outside Baghdad. The hidden equipment cost, the intense operational tempo wore through America's military hardware at a rate that peacetime planning had never anticipated. Tanks, helicopters, armored vehicles, and aircraft were consumed at extraordinary speed. Military stockpiles that had looked invincible in 2003 began to thin, a degradation that would not become fully visible until years later, when new strategic challenges demanded readiness that had quietly eroded during the long years of Middle Eastern occupation. The hidden financial cost. The Bush administration told Congress the war would cost approximately $50 billion. Independent analysts now estimate the true total The Iraq War did not just end when the troops came home. Its consequences rippled outward and remade the world. By destroying the regional balance that had kept Iran in check, America handed Tehran a generational strategic victory. Iran expanded into Iraq through Shia militias, into Syria through support for Assad, into Lebanon through Hezbollah, and into Yemen through the Houthi movement. The entire crescent of the Middle East shifted toward Iranian power, a shift no American administration has been able to reverse. ISIS arose from the chaos and exported apocalyptic violence far beyond Iraq's borders. Terror attacks in Paris, Brussels, Nice, London, Manchester, and Berlin were carried out by individuals radicalized by ISIS propaganda or trained in its camps. The organization demonstrated that a non-state actor, given enough territory and ideological appeal, could wage war on the entire international community simultaneously. The refugee crisis that followed the collapse of Syria and Iraq's ongoing instability sent millions fleeing toward Europe. Far-right parties surged across the continent. Brexit was shaped partly by anxieties about migration. Governments fell. The European Union faced the most serious test of its cohesion since its founding. Russia watched America bleed in Iraq and drew a clear lesson. If the world's most powerful military could be humiliated by insurgents with improvised weapons, what did that mean for American resolve elsewhere? In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. In 2014, it seized Crimea. Each decision was shaped in part by Putin's reading of American will, a reading the Iraq experience had directly influenced. China watched too. While America spent 20 years and $6 trillion in the Middle East, China built infrastructure programs across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, modernized its military, and positioned itself as the dominant Indo-Pacific power. The geopolitical ground shifted beneath America's feet, while its attention was fixed on Baghdad. So what is the verdict? After everything, the cost, the blood, the years, the ripple effects that remade the world, what is the honest historical judgment? Was the Iraq War simply a mistake, a failure of intelligence, bad luck in the fog of war? No, it was a choice. A deliberate, sustained, willful choice made by people who were warned and refused to listen. Military planners raised concerns about post-war stability before the first bomb fell. State Department experts produced detailed risk analyses that were dismissed. European allies begged Washington to wait, to let the weapons inspectors finish their work. Intelligence agencies in Germany and France contradicted the WMD claims being made in Washington. All of it was ignored, not out of ignorance, but out of certainty. The architects of the Iraq War had already decided what they believed and were selecting evidence to support it. That is not an intelligence failure. That is ideological arrogance operating as strategic planning. The lesson of Iraq is not primarily about military tactics or counterinsurgency doctrine. Those are important lessons, and the American military spent years learning them at tremendous cost. The deeper lesson is about the oldest pattern in the history of great powers. Strength without wisdom is not power. It is danger. The most dangerous moment for any nation may not be when it is weak, but when it is so strong, it loses the capacity for doubt. When its military is so overwhelming that its leaders stop asking whether they should do something and only ask whether they can. America entered Iraq with the greatest military force ever assembled, with near-universal global sympathy after September 11th, with an economy at the peak of its post-Cold War dominance. It left with its reputation damaged, its military worn down, its treasury depleted by borrowed money that shifted economic power toward its rivals, its alliances strained by broken trust, its enemies emboldened by proof that the superpower could be humiliated, and a region far more dangerous than the one it had entered. This was meant to be a short war, a demonstration of American resolve and power, a message to the world. It became a generational catastrophe, a lesson taught in blood and treasure about the limits of force, the complexity of nations, and the irreversible consequences of decisions made in arrogance rather than wisdom. Battles can be won quickly, consequences cannot. The war may have been local, the damage was global, and the world we live in today, its conflicts, its power structures, its fractures, and its fears, was shaped, in ways both visible and invisible, by that single decision made in Washington in 2003.